The Rail and the Rogue, the secret history of train robberies, counterfeiters, and the lawmen who built the Treasury Secret Service, the poisoned currency, and the Iron Road. Forget the shootouts, the saloon brawls, and the dusty duels. The real Wild West wasn't a world of simple cattle rustlers and quick draws. It was a chaotic, high-stakes financial war zone, where the very money in your pocket was likely a lie, and the iron rail that promised civilization was instead delivering fortunes into the hands of a new breed of sophisticated criminal. This is the story of the underground economy that nearly destroyed the American dream and the desperate birth of a federal agency so secretive, most people today still don't know its original earth-shaking mission. The year is 1865. The cannons have fallen silent. The Great War is over, and America stands ready to embrace a boundless future. The continent is beckoning, ready to be spanned by the technological marvel of the age, the railway. From the coastal cities, the iron tracks spiderweb outwards, a steel artery pumping lifeblood, people, goods, and most critically, capital, into the vast, untamed territories that would come to be known as the Wild West. But this brand new era of commerce was built on a foundation of rot. Imagine a world where 1 out of every 3 or even 2 banknotes in circulation is a complete fake. A world where the paper money you held could, at any moment, be declared worthless, wiping out your life savings, shattering your community's fragile economy, and spreading panic like a prairie fire. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. It was a national crisis threatening to undo the Union's victory and cripple the dream of Reconstruction. This was the crisis of American counterfeiting, and it was reaching its zenith as the rails began to lay their claim across the land. The Civil War had flooded the market with thousands of different state, city, and private banknotes, along with the new Greenbacks issued by the Union government. This sheer variety, a dizzying, chaotic mess of legal tender, was a counterfeiter's paradise. They were not lone wolves working out of shadowy back rooms. They were sophisticated syndicates, complete with engravers, printers, distributors, and armed guards, all operating an audacious parallel financial system that was fundamentally at war with the United States Treasury. At the epicenter of this economic turmoil was the city of Washington, D.C. It was here, on the very day of President Abraham Lincoln's final cabinet meeting in April 1865, that the solution to this rampant fraud was formalized. Secretary of the Treasury Hugh McCulloch, seeing the financial system teetering on the brink of collapse, finally got the go-ahead to create a specialized division, one with the specific, singular mission to suppress widespread counterfeiting. They called it the Secret Service Division of the Department of the Treasury. The man chosen to lead this tiny fledgling force was William P. Wood, a former Washington detective and a political ally. Wood was a shrewd operator, a natural investigator, and a master of disguise, a necessary trait for a lawman in an age when most people's loyalty lay with local gangs, not distant federal authority. The Secret Service began with a meager budget and a handful of agents, but their scope was continental. Their mandate was simple: hunt the counterfeiters, recover the plates, and restore faith in the nation's money. But as Wood and his men began to chase the paper trail of fraudulent greenbacks, they discovered a terrifying truth. The criminal economy was not only operating out of the major eastern cities, it was thriving in the newly accessible territories of the West, empowered and supplied by the very engine of progress, the rail. The railroad, initially meant to unify America, became the perfect conduit for crime. How the rail facilitated crime? 1. Rapid distribution of counterfeits.
A counterfeiters agent could carry hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake notes from New York to San Francisco in days, not months, distributing the money in dozens of frontier towns along the way where authorities were non-existent or easily bribed. 2. Concentration of wealth, the express car. The express car, managed by companies like Wells Fargo and Adams Express, was the new bank vault. It carried gold bullion, silver ore, registered mail, and massive payrolls for the burgeoning railroad and mining industries. This concentration of movable wealth created an irresistible target. 3. Speedy escape. A rogue could commit a crime in a small town, jump a freight train, and be hundreds of miles away in a matter of hours, far exceeding the speed of the local sheriff and his posse on horseback. The convergence of counterfeiting in the railroad created a new kind of criminal, the professional syndicate that ran a network of illicit operations. They needed to move their product, fake money, and they often financed their ventures by attacking the transport of legitimate wealth, train robberies. This is where the legendary Wild West outlaws begin to step out of the shadows of folklore and into the cold, hard light of financial crime.
The birth of the train robbery. The first truly sensational train robbery in the U.S. is often credited to the Reno gang of Indiana. It was not a glorious affair, but a brutally efficient act of larceny that terrified the public and proved the vulnerability of the Iron Horse. On October 6, 1866, John and Simeon Reno and their accomplices boarded an Ohio and Mississippi Railway passenger train in Seymour, Indiana. The crime was simple. They overpowered the express guard, broke into the Adams Express safe, and escaped with a modest but significant haul. The true significance, however, was in the template they created. The train was the target, the express company was the victim, and the crime was a coordinated assault. The Reno gang, and later more famous figures like Jesse James and the James Younger gang, elevated train robbery to an art form. The Jesse James factor. Jesse James' first train robbery near Adair, Iowa in 1873 was not merely about money, it was a political statement. The gang derailed the train, killing the engineer, before robbing the express car. James, a former Confederate bushwhacker, painted his crimes as acts of rebellion against northern corporations, the railroads, that were exploiting the South and West. This narrative turned him into a folk hero, a romantic figure striking back at the industrial Goliaths, despite the brutal reality of his crimes. His continued success highlighted the crippling inability of local law enforcement to operate across state lines or counter the mobility of the gang. The Secret Service, though officially mandated to focus on counterfeiting, soon found itself drawn into the escalating violence of the rail system. The express companies often used their own armed guards and hired private detectives, most famously the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The war against the rogues was being fought by private entities, a sign of the government's initial hesitation to fully police the frontier. The Secret Service's authority had been broadened in 1867 to include detecting persons perpetrating frauds against the government, which technically gave them jurisdiction over counterfeiting, land fraud, and even certain types of mail theft committed on the rail. As their agents pursued counterfeit money, they were constantly crossing paths with the train robbers, realizing that the same shadowy networks supplied both. The Secret Service takes the West. The shadow of the Klan and the federal reach. While William P. Wood and his handful of original agents began their primary mission of tackling counterfeiting in the financial centers of the East, a separate, equally urgent crisis was ripping apart the post-war South, the violence and insurrection waged by the Ku Klux Klan.
This is where the story of the Secret Service takes its first astonishing detour, establishing it not just as currency cops, but as America's first domestic federal investigative force. Following the Civil War, the federal government was determined to ensure the rights of freedmen and enforce Reconstruction policies. Yet local governments and state courts were either unwilling or unable to prosecute the widespread campaign of terror carried out by the Klan and other vigilante groups. In 1867, Congress quietly broadened the USS mandate with an appropriation for detecting persons perpetrating frauds against the government. While intended to cover customs evasion, land fraud, and mail theft, Chief Wood and his political superiors recognized a wider application. The systemic attack on federal officials, Reconstruction policies, and the voting rights of citizens was in effect a massive fraud against the government and the Constitution itself. Wood's agents were tasked with infiltrating the Klan. They were masters of disguise and infiltration, skills honed hunting counterfeiting rings, but now applied to a far more dangerous political enemy. Operatives traveled deep into the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama, posing as traveling salesmen, carpetbaggers, or even sympathetic Southern whites. They were risking their lives in a way few other federal agents did at the time. The evidence gathered by these agents, accounts of midnight raids, burnings, beatings, and murders, was instrumental. Their reports provided the basis for President Ulysses S. Grant to invoke the Enforcement Acts, 1870 to 1871, authorizing federal troops and federal courts to intervene. This early USS operation set a profound precedent. It proved that a centralized, secret federal detective force was necessary to enforce national law where local authority had collapsed. The lesson was learned swiftly. The same organized, syndicated behavior that produced counterfeit currency was at the heart of political terrorism. The Secret Service had the tools, invisibility, and intelligence gathering to fight both. Western outposts and the lone agent. As the focus of crime shifted west via the rail, the Secret Service had to follow. They couldn't rely on the vast networks of informants and city police that existed in Boston or Philadelphia. The West was raw, sparsely populated, and deeply skeptical of any authority that wasn't local, armed, and familiar. Key USSS offices were established in strategic rail hubs. Chicago, the gateway to the West, where counterfeit plates often changed hands before heading to remote presses. Omaha, Nebraska, a vital junction for the Union Pacific, the artery of wealth flowing from the Pacific coast. San Francisco, a terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad and a major clearinghouse for gold and legitimate currency, making it a target-rich environment for sophisticated fraud and smuggling. These offices were often tiny, a single agent and perhaps a secretary, but they represented the long, shadowy arm of the U.S. Treasury. One notable early Western operative was John G. Culp. He was an archetype of the Secret Service man on the frontier. Quiet, impeccably dressed, a sharp contrast to the rough locals, and fiercely intelligent. He had to be a master of local geography, an expert on currency forensics, and a talented con artist, all while being prepared to defend himself with whatever arms he chose to carry. The challenge wasn't merely finding the counterfeiters, it was getting a conviction. A counterfeiter caught with a press in a Montana mining town often found a sympathetic local jury convinced that the federal government, with its greenbacks, was the true enemy. Culp and his peers therefore had to build cases ironclad enough to survive hostile local politics. This meant relying heavily on documentary evidence, the paper trail of ink, specific engraving defects, and distribution networks, which often provided a more reliable conviction than eyewitness testimony in a biased courtroom. The Pinkerton problem. The rise of the rail and the express car created a security vacuum that the government was slow to fill. This left the door open for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were, for a time, the most powerful private law enforcement agency in the world, contracted by the railroads and express companies to protect their assets. The relationship between the USSS and the Pinkertons was fraught with both necessity and rivalry. A necessary alliance. In the hunt for the notorious Jesse James and the James Younger gang, the Secret Service and Pinkertons occasionally cooperated. Jesse James was not merely a train robber. His gang's raids often included the theft of government mail, putting them within USSS jurisdiction for mail fraud. The Pinkertons had vast resources, including a large network of informants and a willingness to operate outside the strict legal restraints of federal bureaucracy. When the James gang was operating across multiple states, the Pinkertons provided a rapid response cross-jurisdictional force that the small Secret Service could not yet match. A deep rivalry. Federal agents viewed the Pinkertons with suspicion, seeing them as mercenaries whose first loyalty was to their corporate paymasters, not to justice or the law itself. This tension came to a head when Pinkerton operatives were accused of excessive violence or when they failed to secure the necessary evidence for federal prosecution. Ultimately, the Pinkerton reliance highlighted the need for a competent, fully federal authority. Train robbers like the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and Company, operated with impunity because they understood the legal gaps. Local law stopped at county lines, and private detectives had no ultimate constitutional authority. Only the USSS, operating under the full authority of the Treasury, possessed the necessary power to investigate crime and enforce federal law across state lines. The master of the plate, Ben Boyd, and forensic crime. The Secret Service's most valuable asset was its expertise in identifying counterfeit money. This often led them into a years-long duel with the king of the counterfeiters during the late 1860s and 1870s, Ben Boyd. Ben was a master engraver, a man whose artistic skill was nearly indistinguishable from that of the official Treasury Bureau of Engraving and Printing. His notes were so perfect, they were dubbed Ben's Imperfects. Perfectly crafted plates, marred only by intentional, microscopic defects or small, almost imperceptible flaws meant to distinguish his work from the real thing, perhaps as a twisted signature. Ben's fake $100 Treasury notes became infamous. The hunt for Boyd showcases the birth of early forensic science within the Secret Service. Agents didn't just look for bad printing, they became experts in micrology, studying the minute details of the lines etched into the copper plate. They analyzed paper stock, the watermarks, the texture, the composition of the rag fibers to trace the source of the counterfeiter's raw materials. They became experts in ink composition, noting specific pigments or chemical properties in the counterfeit ink that differed from the genuine Treasury formula. After years of relentless investigation, often going undercover to infiltrate the distribution networks stretching from Ohio to California, Boyd was finally caught in Iowa in 1876. The seizure of his perfectly cut plates was a monumental victory, representing a temporary crippling of the most sophisticated counterfeiting operation in the country. It was the kind of patient, technically complex work that defined the Secret Service and distinguished them from the shoot-first Pinkertons or the slow-moving local sheriffs. They were first and foremost financial detectives. Land fraud and the tragic price. While train robberies captured headlines, the largest single economic crime against the federal government in the West was the organized theft of public lands. Millions of acres, intended for homesteaders or the establishment of national forests, were fraudulently claimed by syndicates using forged documents, corrupt land office officials, and dummy corporations. This was a crime of scale, not sudden violence, but it directly violated the USSS mandate against frauds against the government. The Secret Service was tasked with investigating these massive, complex schemes. In the vast, remote territories of the West, particularly in Wyoming, Colorado, and Oregon, these investigations were inherently dangerous. The syndicates involved were powerful, politically connected, and accustomed to acting as local monarchs. This is the chapter of the unsung heroes. Agents would spend years in dusty, hostile towns, reviewing land deeds and interviewing witnesses. The risks were immense. On November 3, 1907, Secret Service operative Joseph A. Walker was killed while working on a land fraud case in Oregon. Walker had spent months gathering evidence on a conspiracy to defraud the government out of thousands of acres of timberland. His murder was a brutal sign that the Wild West's underground economy was willing to kill to protect its profits, whether they came from fake currency, stolen gold, or stolen land. Walker's sacrifice, far from the glamour of presidential protection, underscored the original, deadly mission of the Secret Service, defending the very financial and territorial integrity of the United States. His death was a reminder that the Wild West was not just a stage for cinematic gun battles, but a treacherous landscape where the quiet, methodical federal lawman was often the most vulnerable.
The Wild Bunch and the High-Stakes Game. The Wild Bunch as a business enterprise. The train robbers of the 1890s weren't your father's outlaws. They weren't just the remnants of Civil War guerrillas like Jesse James. They were sophisticated, professional criminals who treated robbery as a business. At the apex of this evolution stood the Wild Bunch, led by Robert Leroy Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy, and his chief associate, Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. Forget the dusty, ragged image of the bandit. The Wild Bunch was methodical. Their genius lay in organization and logistics. They didn't just stumble upon trains, they orchestrated their heists with corporate-level planning. Their business model: intelligence. They cultivated a network of informants, ranch hands, telegraph operators, saloon keepers, and even railroad employees who provided inside information on shipments, payroll schedules, and the location of guards. The circuit. They established a vast outlaw trail stretching across Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. This circuit was punctuated by secure hideouts, most famously the almost mythical Hole in the Wall in Wyoming. These locations were chosen for their geographic defensibility, access to fresh horses, and reliable local support from sympathetic ranchers who provided provisions and sanctuary for a fee. Speed and mobility. After a crime, the gang would use pre-placed relays of fresh horses, often utilizing 3 or 4 separate remounts to outdistance any posse. Their getaway was timed to perfection, exploiting the geographic gaps and lack of unified law enforcement jurisdiction. Specialization. The gang wasn't just made up of shooters, they had specialists. Kid Curry, Harvey Logan, was the designated enforcer and gunman. Cassidy was the brilliant strategist and financier, and others specialized in explosives for the express car safes, and forging papers, sometimes used to pay the gang's local allies. In the eyes of the railroads and the U.S. Treasury, the Wild Bunch was not just a criminal threat. They were an economic competitor operating a successful, parallel underground economy fueled by the very trains meant to enrich the nation. The audacity of Wilcox. No single event better illustrates the audacity of this criminal enterprise than the Wilcox train robbery on June 2, 1909, near Wilcox, Wyoming. It was a perfectly executed maneuver against the giant Union Pacific Railroad. The target was the westbound Overland Flyer, a passenger and express train known to carry a large cash shipment for mining payrolls. Stopping the train, the gang flagged down the train at a remote pre-selected location. They forced the engineer and fireman to uncouple the locomotive and the express car from the passenger cars, driving them nearly a mile down the track, a crucial tactic to separate the prize from the armed passengers and guards. The dynamite safe. The express car was fortified,
But the gang's explosive expert, likely Kid Curry, placed dynamite charges under the safe door. The resulting explosion ripped the safe open and nearly derailed the car, but they secured the bounty, an estimated $30,000 to $50,000 in gold coins and banknotes, a massive sum at the time, equivalent to over $1 million today. The clean getaway. The gang didn't linger. Within minutes, they were gone, disappearing into the vast, lawless expanses, heading for the hole-in-the-wall country. They even took the precaution of igniting the express car as a distraction and to destroy any potential forensic evidence. The Wilcox robbery was a national scandal. It showed that the richest corporation in the country, the Union Pacific, could be defeated by a handful of riders. The message to the financial world was clear. The rail system was not safe. The federal manhunt begins. The scale of the Wilcox heist and the subsequent robberies demanded a coordinated response that neither local sheriffs nor the private Pinkertons could sustain alone. The Union Pacific, Wells Fargo, and the Treasury Department realized that only a persistent, multi-jurisdictional federal effort could break the back of the Wild Bunch. The key to the new strategy was the telegraph. Information Central. The Union Pacific and the express companies established a central intelligence operation. As soon as a robbery was reported, the description of the men, the horses, and the direction of travel was immediately wired to every possible town along the outlaw trail, often beating the robbers by hours or days. The mounted posse car. The Union Pacific, in an unprecedented move, created a special armored baggage car designed to carry a highly trained, armed posse and their horses. This car could be attached to the nearest locomotive and rushed to the crime scene, giving the lawmen the level of mobility that finally matched the outlaws. But the real threat to the Wild Bunch came from the Secret Service and its expanding investigative reach. Though the Pinkertons were hired to do the shooting, it was often the patient money-tracking work of the federal agents that strangled the gang's support structure. The Secret Service's focus was always on the paper trail. They weren't just interested in the gunslingers. They wanted the men who provided the explosives, fenced the stolen gold, and printed the fake currency sometimes used to pay the gang's local allies. They hunted the people who laundered the hot money, the very lifeblood of the Wild Bunch enterprise. The end of the trail. The lawman's strategy. The man who took on the responsibility of coordinating this massive federal corporate manhunt was often Fred J. Dodge, a skilled operative working for Wells Fargo who maintained close ties with the Secret Service. The strategy developed was simple but devastating. Destroy the gang's sanctuaries. Targeting the fences. Secret Service agents and Pinkertons began systematically raiding the saloons, ranches, and hideouts known to support the Wild Bunch. They were relentless in arresting and prosecuting any individual caught aiding the gang, using federal charges of conspiracy, mail theft, or counterfeiting to ensure stiff prison sentences that local courts would never deliver. The high price. The federal government and the express companies offered massive rewards, putting an unprecedented bounty on the heads of the gang members. This forced a schism within the Wild Bunch, as paranoia and greed began to turn former allies into informants. The coordinated pressure worked. By 1900, the Wild Bunch, particularly the violent Kid Curry, became too hot to handle. The outlaw trail was no longer safe. The final twist. In a true testament to the Secret Service's financial focus, the gang attempted one last desperate financial maneuver. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid tried to hide in plain sight, living in Fort Worth, Texas, and even taking a now iconic photograph in fine suits. When the law closed in, their ultimate escape was not back to the mountains, but a desperate flight south to Argentina, using the profits from their crimes to buy a ranch and try to start over, a final attempt to legitimize their ill-gotten gains. Their desperate flight out of the country was proof the law's reach had finally exceeded the rail's speed. The relentless, coordinated federal pressure driven by the need to secure the nation's finances, had systematically dismantled the Wild West's most successful criminal syndicate. The stage was set for the Secret Service to transition from its founding mission, a change that would be cemented by a shocking tragedy. The unexpected mission, from counterfeit to protection. The Accidental Protectors. The United States Secret Service, USSS, was founded to protect the nation's money, not its president. Yet by the turn of the 20th century, the agents of the Treasury Department were frequently the only lawmen available with the combination of skill, federal authority, and nonpartisan loyalty necessary for presidential security. Their expertise in undercover work, intelligence gathering, and operating across state lines made them uniquely qualified, almost by accident. The shift began subtly. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, the nation was gripped by social upheaval, labor unrest, and the rise of radical political ideologies, including anarchism. Threats against the president, though common, were treated haphazardly, often left to the District of Columbia police or the military. President Grover Cleveland was the first to recognize the quiet competence of the Treasury agents. While serving his second term in the 1890s, he grew concerned about his personal safety. He wasn't threatened by a wild bunch outlaw, but by the growing threat of the political radical. With no official federal protective force, Cleveland quietly asked for a small detail of Secret Service agents borrowed from the anti-counterfeiting squad to watch over him and his family. This was an unofficial, ad hoc arrangement. The agents' primary mission remained tracking down ragged edges and prosecuting land fraud, but they served double duty as part-time presidential guards. The SSS had become so effective at its financial mission that its agents were viewed as the federal government's most reliable and disciplined detectives. They were the men who operated in the shadows, who knew how to infiltrate groups, and, crucially, whose reputation for integrity was essential for protecting the highest office. However, despite this growing awareness, Congress repeatedly refused to mandate or fund a permanent presidential protective unit. America, historically suspicious of permanent federal police or standing armies, clung to the idea that the office of the president was symbolically safe. This naive assumption was about to be shattered. The shadow of anarchy. The 19th century closed with a chilling, recurring pattern of tragedy in the United States. 3 presidents fell to assassins' bullets. Abraham Lincoln, 1865, killed just months before the Secret Service was formally established. James A. Garfield, 1881, shot at a train station by a disgruntled office seeker. William McKinley, 1901, targeted by an anarchist. The Garfield assassination was a clear warning. The President of the United States was shot in a public place with virtually no security. The event spurred no change in security policy, only a temporary increase in paranoia. By 1901, the prevailing threat was no longer the outlaw seeking loot, but the anarchist seeking political chaos. These individuals were often lone wolves, motivated by ideology, and far harder to detect than a highly visible train robber. The Secret Service agents, masters of infiltrating financial conspiracies, possessed the skills to manage this threat, but they lacked the mandate. The tragedy of William McKinley. The moment that irrevocably changed the Secret Service forever occurred on September 6, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. President William McKinley was greeting the public in the Temple of Music, an exercise in democracy that was deemed necessary for public morale. Against the advice of local police, the receiving line was long and exposed. His security detail was sparse, consisting primarily of one man, Secret Service agent George Foster. He was an elite operative, but he was alone against an impossible task. In the line stood Leon Czolgosz, an American-born anarchist. Czolgosz approached the president with his right hand wrapped in a handkerchief, feigning injury. Inside the handkerchief was a .32 caliber Iver Johnson revolver. As the president reached out to shake the bandaged hand, Cholesgo's fired twice at point-blank range. The scene descended into instant chaos. Agent Foster, despite being overwhelmed, immediately tackled the assassin, but the damage was done. 8 days later, McKinley died from his wounds. The national outrage was immense. How, in the most powerful nation in the earth, could the president be assassinated in such a public, preventable manner? The failure was not a failure of courage. Agent Foster had acted instantly, but a failure of policy and mandate. The Secret Service, the best detectives in the nation, simply weren't allowed to fully secure the president. The permanent mandate. The assassination of William McKinley delivered a shockwave that reached every corner of Washington, D.C. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, who ascended to the presidency, was a proponent of a strong federal government and understood that security could not be left to chance. The solution was already on the payroll. Within months of the assassination, Congress, recognizing the urgency and the proven capability of the Treasury Department's detectives, finally acted. In 1902, the Treasury Secret Service was officially charged with the continuous and permanent protection of the president. Their primary mission had officially shifted. The skills developed over 40 years of fighting the Wild West's underground economy, the ability to run deep undercover operations, to track financial transactions across states, to build airtight federal cases, and to coordinate investigations using cutting-edge technology like the telegraph, were now deployed for an even higher purpose: personal protection. The Wild West, in all its financial chaos, had inadvertently trained the world's most elite security force. Epilogue: The Rail and the Legacy. The trail of the rogue, from the backroom counterfeiter to the explosive train robber, did not simply disappear. But by the early 20th century, the nature of crime and the government's response had fundamentally changed. The era of the great train robberies was over, replaced by better express car security, sophisticated safes, and the relentless pressure of federal law enforcement. The agents who once hunted Butch Cassidy and cracked open fake money syndicates were now patrolling the White House grounds, their skills transformed into protection and intelligence. The Secret Service stands today as a constant, tangible link to the tumultuous birth of the modern American economy. It is a federal agency born of crisis, the crisis of a poisoned currency and the terror of the open rail. Its secret history is the true, untold story of the Wild West's underground economy, where the lawmen who built its foundation were not glamorous marshals, but quiet, brilliant detectives tasked with saving the American dollar before they were tasked with saving the American president. The legacy is clear. To protect the integrity of the nation, you must protect its finance, and sometimes you must protect the man who embodies its power. The rail and the rogue created the lawman, and the lawman saved the Union.